simultaneously, that in a sense caused a window of opportunity to open that gave the OAU an opportunity to assess its human rights record and to ensure that at least for public relations purposes, a treaty would be set in place in the African continent. So from the word go, the African Charter, which was adopted in 1981, was a product of compromise. It was, on the one hand, influenced by those who were seriously discontented with the regime of dictators and saw the window of opportunity as a chance to install a truly progressive human rights instrument on the continent. But at the same time, at that period of Africa's history, most of the leaders of the OAU were still not elected, were either dictators or merely in one-party regimes that at least were not enjoying the legitimacy of the people. So their interest was to create an African Charter that would merely provide the semblance of a human rights instrument and not a true transformative document. In terms of the domestic African human rights situation, the 1980s still saw mostly unelected leaders in place in Africa, the concomitant human rights violations to uphold regimes that lack legitimacy, and especially also regression in terms of the socio-economic situation, the right to development, if you like, situation within the African continent. So the turning point, as it were, in terms of the historical division would be 1989, 1990. That would be the period when the so-called third wave of democracy came across Africa. Now you'd be familiar, I'm sure, with Huntington's idea that there were three waves of democracy, and the third wave of democracy started essentially globally in 1974 with the demise of dictatorship in Portugal, and the events around the late 1980s was a continuation of that third wave of democracy when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet republics ended in the form they had existed. In Africa, the third wave really came about, or came to be having an impact on Africa exactly at that time, in about 1989, 90. For three reasons, principally, I'd say. Firstly, the one-party state, which was closely associated with the idea of the Soviet, East European, and other one-party dictatorships in Africa, that was delegitimized in terms of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Secondly, there was the problem of economic growth and lack of economic growth that caused the IMF and the World Bank to start vigorously on its project of structural adjustment, which also impacted then on the idea of liberal democracy being installed in Africa. And thirdly, there was the growth essentially of a much stronger civil society movement and organizations within African states. These three forces coincided to bring about people's revolution, Congress of the People, for example, first in Benin and in Zambia, and then flowing across the continent to a number of other states. What we then see in the 1990s is the introduction essentially of multi-partyism in Africa. In a few years, in the space of a few years, more than 3/4 of African states had fundamentally revised their constitutions, their constitutional orders, and introduced multi-party states. Now, in terms of these new constitutions, what we find relevant to human rights is Bill of Rights. So, invariably, the new African state of the third wave would see in place a Bill of Rights, in other words, justiciable human rights, together with the idea of the rule of law within liberal democratic institutions. So that introduces the second phase of the independent period, and great promise for human rights, it would seem. If one group in a loosely knit network of loosely knit societies would conquer another, it is often pointed to the lack of humanity exercised towards the vanquished, the conquered group. I would answer that perhaps that demonstrates that international humanitarian law, the law that regulates situations of conflict or warfare, had not been developed in the time when we are talking about. That would be applicable to all other societies that also existed, and the conduct pertaining to those societies prior to the development of, for example, the Geneva Conventions, the Hague Convention, that regulate human conduct in situations of conflict. Also, in respect of human rights as utilitarian concern, did human rights exist as a means of bringing a claim to some form of independent tribunal, or a means of finding redress, a way of ensuring individual protection against the group, which is often the way in which human rights is understood in our time? The answer depends also on where you would have found yourself in Africa. In Africa, in the traditional sense, obviously there was a great variety of societal governance structures. In very informal governance systems, there would not perhaps have been any form of accountability mechanism or redress avenues that could be explored by the individual. But in greater kingdoms or structures such as the Akan Kingdom and the Ghana Kingdom in West Africa, there were in fact councils and complaint mechanisms that could be utilized that were much more akin to the human rights as accountability that we today more embrace. So the conclusion really about traditional Africa is that both in terms of human rights in an ontological sense and human rights as a utilitarian concern, there are enough indication that human rights was respected. Certainly not universally or not without aberration, but in principle this seems to be arguable that in fact human rights prospered, although certainly not in all kinds of societies in the sense I explained. The transatlantic slave trade period, colonialism in Africa, certainly stands as an epoch much better described in terms of human rights abuse than in any sense of human rights observance. I do not intend to explore the litany of human rights abuses that we could associate with these periods. But let me just for a moment address the argument that colonialism itself also, at least in some respects, ensured the improvement of human rights within the colonized territories. For example, in terms of education, colonial schools, the introduction of formal education would be held forth as examples, or the introduction of formal medicine, hospitals, etc. While this may be true, I think it would be fair to say that it was not the case of introducing human rights directed principally at the benefit of the colonized, but surely benefits that accrue to them would be incidental to the objectives pursued principally for the prospering and the stabilization of the colonial project. In terms of the post-colonial or the independent period, usually this period is said to commence, to start in 1957, when the first sub-Sahara African country, Ghana, obtained its independence. Independence as a product of anti-colonialist struggles and in the context of Pan-Africanist awareness among first people in the diaspora and later leaders and influential individuals within Africa itself. Unfortunately, the optimism of independence soon gave way to the reality of a mirroring by the post-colonial authorities of the practices in many respects that had been put in place by the colonial authorities. We find in Africa the emergence of one-party dictatorships. We find the use of security measures, the introduction of security legislation to stifle opposition, and in the 1960s into the 1970s, brutal dictatorships such as those under Idi Amin in Uganda and the Emperor Jean Boudel Bokassa in the Central African Republic. It is in this context, in 1979, that the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the mainstay of the African regional system, was adopted. And without going into too much of the history of this African Charter, when the drafting was approved, rather, by the Assembly of the African, the OAU at the time, without going into too much detail, it was the demise of Idi Amin and Bokassa